Do you remember the weight of a 50-pence piece in your hand? Not the idea of it, not the vague memory of spending it, the actual physical sensation. That chunky, 7-sided silver coin, cool against your palm, slightly heavier than you expected for something so small. It felt like a decision. It felt like a key to another world. You had been saving it, maybe in a ceramic pig on your windowsill, or in the zip pocket of a blue duffel bag that you only used for school trips and Saturdays. It represented weeks of restraint. Every penny sweet you did not buy was a step closer to this moment. Or perhaps you had just been given it by your nan after Sunday lunch, folded inside a piece of kitchen paper the way she always did, as if the coin itself needed protecting from the world. It was a secret contract between generations. A small act of financial independence wrapped in white tissue. And on that particular Saturday morning, let us say it is 1974, though it could have been any year in that decade, you knew exactly where you were going. You were going to Woolworths, the high street's red and gold heart. The moment you pushed through those heavy glass doors, the noise hit you first. Not a terrible noise, a warm one, a busy one. The sound of 1,000 domestic lives crossing paths in search of something affordable and exciting. The clatter of metal fixtures, the hiss of the pick-and-mix scoop, the tinny sound of something vaguely musical being piped through a speaker system that was doing its absolute best. It was the sound of the British Saturday, organized and rhythmic. The floor was that particular shade of dark red linoleum that seemed to exist only in Woolworths and nowhere else on earth, polished into a kind of dull shine by 1,000 Saturday feet before yours. It was a floor that held the history of 1,000,000 small purchases. And the smell. Oh, the smell. Popcorn and cheap perfume and something metallic and new, all layered together into a scent that, if you caught a trace of it today, would stop you dead in your tracks. It was the olfactory signature of a decade. A smell that promised everything from a new screwdriver to a bag of fudge. You did not linger by the makeup counters or the record singles, though you noticed them. You were heading somewhere specific, with purpose, with the single-minded clarity that only a child on a mission truly possesses. You were heading to the toy aisle, that brightly colored oasis at the back of the store. And in your pocket, you had 50 pence. Now, 50 pence in 1974 was not nothing. It is worth pausing on that, because the modern mind, trained to think of 50 pence as barely enough for a newspaper, struggles to hold the real scale of it. It was a significant unit of joy. 50 pence in 1974 had the purchasing power of somewhere between 6 and 7 pounds. In today is money, depending on the index you use. That is not a fortune, but it is not nothing either. It was enough to make a real choice. Enough to feel the particular pleasure of deliberation. Enough to feel the particular pleasure of deliberating between things that genuinely cost something, rather than settling for a penny sweet and walking out feeling shortchanged. You were a player in the economy now, a tiny capitalist with a 7-sided ticket to adventure. Woolworths in the early 1970s occupied a curious position in British retail life. Founded originally as a 5 and dime concept imported from America, it had evolved into something entirely its own, a kind of democratic palace for the British public. It was where a working-class child and a middle-class child stood in the same aisle, fingering the same packaging, weighing the same decisions. In the toy aisle of Woolworths, social distinctions dissolved into the shared anxiety of choosing between a Matchbox car and a Corgi helicopter. The toy section was rarely grand. It was not a dedicated toy shop in the way that a specialist retailer might have been, but it was there, reliable as rain, stocked with things that mattered intensely to the people who needed them most. It was the department of small wonders. And if Woolworths was the high street answer, then Argos, still relatively new in the early 70s, having opened its first stores in 1973, was the dream catalog. It changed the way we wanted things. It moved the toy shop from the aisle to the living room floor, that catalog. If you grew up in Britain in the second half of the 70s, you know exactly the one. The thick, laminated cover. The smell of the fresh print when it arrived, which was not entirely unlike the smell of a new exercise book at the start of term. Slightly chemical, slightly promising. You would sit on the floor of the living room with it spread open across your knees, and you would fold down the corners of the pages, and you would circle things in biro, and the act of circling them felt almost as satisfying as owning them. It was a pre-digital wish list, written in blue ink. But today, let us be specific. Because nostalgia that stays general is just sentiment. The real thing, the kind that catches in your throat, lives in the particular. Let us talk about what 50 pence actually bought you. The physical objects that shaped our Saturdays. What you picked up. What you carried to the counter. What the woman behind the till put into a paper bag, or did not bother with a bag at all because it was big enough to carry under your arm. That moment of transfer was the most important 5 seconds of your week. Let us talk about Airfix. If you were a certain kind of child in the 1970s, and there were a great many of you, more than 2 million kits sold in Britain annually by the mid-70s, Airfix was not just a toy. It was a practice, a discipline of the hands and mind. It was a Saturday afternoon ritual that began with the smell of polystyrene cement and ended hours later with paint-stained fingers and a small gray Spitfire drying on a piece of newspaper on the kitchen table. It was the slow art of the plastic sprue. The entry-level Airfix kits, the Series 1 models, the ones with the sky blue band across the top of the box, retailed in Woolworths for between 15 and 25 pence during the early to mid-70s, which meant that 50 pence could buy you two, a Hurricane and a Messerschmitt, an entire dogfight for 1 coin. The box was almost more exciting than the contents. The artwork on Airfix boxes in the 1970s was produced by a small group of illustrators, most notably Roy Cross, whose paintings depicted aircraft in violent, glorious motion, banking through clouds, banks of flak bursting around them. The horizon tilted at a dramatic angle that suggested not just speed but history, urgency, consequence. These were paintings that made you feel something before you had even opened the cellophane. You would study every detail of the artwork, and already the model felt half-assembled in your imagination. Inside, the parts were arranged on a plastic runner, a rectangular frame of brittle gray or olive green polystyrene from which each tiny component had to be carefully removed with a craft knife or, if you were younger and impatient, with your thumbnail. Each snap was a step toward reality. The instructions were printed in black and white on a single folded sheet of paper, numbered stages rendered in tiny diagrams that sometimes required a magnifying glass and always required a certain faith. Stage 7 was always the hardest. Stage 7 was, structurally speaking, an act of optimism. The smell of the polystyrene cement, Airfix's own brand, in the little orange tin with the tiny brush inside the lid, is one of those scents that exists in a sealed compartment of the brain, inaccessible until triggered, and then overwhelming. It was not a pleasant smell by any rational measure. It was the smell of making. But it was the smell of making something, of a Saturday given over entirely to concentration and creation, and the satisfying click of a wing assembly finally finding its socket. In that small space between the glue and the plastic, the rest of the world disappeared. You had to wait for the paint to dry. That was the part that tested you. The Humbrol enamels, tiny tins, each one with a color name that was somehow more evocative than it had any right to be. RAF blue, gunmetal, matte khaki, scarlet. These required hours between coats. And you were 9 or 11 and hours were long. You would check on the model repeatedly, pressing a fingertip very lightly to the painted surface, leaving a tiny impression, pulling your hand back as if you had touched something holy. It was a lesson in patience that we never asked for, but always received. The finished model was never quite right, of course. The seams were visible. The decals had gone on slightly crooked, or one had torn, or you had applied the roundel to the wrong wing. The undercarriage sat at a slight angle that could not be corrected without breaking something, but it was yours, you had made it, and it sat on your shelf or your windowsill for months, sometimes years, gathering dust in the way that only plastic models and old encyclopedias do. A fine gray coat that somehow seemed to belong to it, like camouflage, like evidence of survival. 50 pence, 2 kits, 2 afternoons of absolute focus. But 50 pence could also lead you down the path of die-cast metal. In 1974, a Matchbox 75 series car was roughly 25 pence. Corgi Juniors were similarly priced. 50 pence meant a brand new garage, a pair of vehicles that felt heavy, cold, and permanent in your hand. These were not just cars. They were pieces of engineering. The suspension on a Matchbox car, that tiny bit of give when you pressed down on it, was a miracle of 1970s manufacturing. You would spend the whole afternoon driving them across the landscapes of the living room carpet. Now let us return to the Argos catalog, the 1977 edition specifically. It was a document of democratic aspiration, 600 pages of things that British families wanted and were saving towards. The toy sections were the promised land of the 300s. The toy sections began somewhere around page 300 and something, and they were marked by a particular change in paper quality in your imagination, even though the paper itself was uniform throughout. You knew when you had arrived. You could feel the shift in your pulse. For 50 pence, or thereabouts, you were in the territory of the smaller, the simpler, the things that did not require their own shelf in the catalog. A pack of Waddingtons playing cards, a set of jacks with its small red rubber ball, a spirograph replacement disc set, small, functional, and perfect. But let us focus on one thing. One specific, beautiful, maddening thing that cost 49 pence in the 1977 Argos catalog and came in a flat rectangular box with a plastic see-through lid. A etch-a-sketch. A masterpiece of mechanical drawing. The red plastic frame, the 2 white dials, the gray aluminium powder on the inside of the screen that responded to your stylus with that satisfying dark line. Precise as a pencil, but somehow mechanical, deliberate, architectural. It was the drafting table of the 1970s child. The thing about the Etch-a-Sketch was the constraints. You could only move horizontally or vertically or diagonally if you turned both knobs simultaneously, a coordination challenge that seemed deceptively simple and was, in practice, humbling. It taught us the beauty of the straight line. You wanted to draw a house. What you got was a house with no curves, no circles, a chimney that went slightly wrong on the top left corner, and windows that were perfect. The windows were always perfect. Squares were your friend on an Etch-a-Sketch. In a world of curves, we sought the comfort of the 90-degree angle. But you know what the real ritual was, don't you? The shaking. When you had finished your drawing, or when you had made a mistake you could not undo, because unlike paper, the Etch-a-Sketch had no forgiveness, no eraser, only the total annihilation of the shake. You turned it upside down and shook it, and the screen went gray. Uniformly, completely, mercilessly gray. Everything gone. The drawing you had spent 40 minutes on, the one that was, by the end, actually quite good, actually the best thing you had done on this thing, gone. Like it had never existed. Like a digital file deleted before it was saved. There was something almost Buddhist about the Etch-a-Sketch that you did not have the vocabulary for when you were 10 years old, but you felt it. The impermanence. The practice of making, and then unmaking, and then making again. Not as loss, exactly, as cycle. The eternal return of the gray screen. 50 pence was also, in the right Woolworths on the right day in 1974 or 75, enough for a Subbuteo team. Not the pitch, not the goals, not the full set with the stadium pieces, just a team. A single box, roughly the size of a paperback novel containing 11 tiny plastic footballers. And the thing about Subbuteo was that it never worked as well as it did in your imagination. In your imagination, you were the manager, the commentator, the crowd of 30,000. You were at Wembley. The ball, that tiny white sphere, was perfectly placed. Your index finger was poised. The flick was precise. In reality, your player fell over. The base wobbled. The ball went sideways. The goalkeeper, which was a different shape, a flat plastic cutout on a little wire that you had to slide back and forth, was in entirely the wrong position because you had moved it last turn and forgotten. It was a game of beautiful errors. But the thing was, none of that mattered. The game was texture. That green baize cloth, already slightly wrinkled, never quite laying flat, and the bright colors of the players, and the fact that you had named each one. That one, the one with the slightly bent leg from where you had pressed too hard. That was Keegan. Subbuteo individual teams, the flat-packed boxes, could be found for 35 to 50 pence. By 1974, over 300 team strips were available, covering not just the first division clubs, but European sides and international teams. You chose your second team for contrast. You needed the fiction of opposition. Now, there is a moment. And if you are of a certain age, you know exactly the moment I mean. That sits at the center of all of this. It is not the purchasing. It is not even the playing. It is the moment just before, the precipice of possibility. You are standing in the toy aisle or kneeling on the carpet. You have the 50 pence. It is real. It is committed. You are going to spend it. The question is only what you are going to spend it on. And in that moment, every option is still possible. The Airfix kit and the Etch-a-Sketch and the Subbuteo team all exist simultaneously in your future. Nothing has been ruled out. The coin is in your pocket, and the world is, for this brief window, entirely open. That feeling, that specific, contained, complete feeling of potential, is what 50 pence bought you. The thing itself was almost secondary. It was the purchase of a dream that had not yet been narrowed by choice. Because what you were really purchasing in a Woolworths in 1974 with a 7-sided coin your nan had given you was the experience of wanting something and being able to get it, of having a need that was proportionate to your means. It was the balanced economy of childhood. No debt, no interest, just the trade. The world those shops belonged to is gone. Woolworths closed its last stores on the 6th of January 2009 after 88 years of trading in Britain. The final weekend sales were quietly heartbreaking. Not just a retailer, but a texture of life was being lost. A sound, a particular quality of Saturday. Argos still exists, transformed and restructured. Its famous catalog discontinued in 2020 after 47 years and over 3 billion copies. The catalog, more than the stores, was the thing that felt irreplaceable. Because a catalog is not a website. A website is a search result. A catalog is a journey. A website gives you everything immediately and asks you nothing. A catalog asks you to decide, to sit with it, to fold down corners, to circle, to negotiate with yourself, with your savings, with the gap between what you wanted and what was possible. That negotiation was not a hardship. It was the entire point. It was an education in desire. The toys themselves, the Airfix models and the Etch-a-Sketches and the Subbuteo teams were vehicles for something that is not made anymore, or rather is not sold. They were vehicles for time. For a particular quality of time, slow and concentrated and entirely your own, a time without interruptions or updates. Just the gray plastic runner and the smell of polystyrene cement and the tiny diagram on the instruction sheet and the afternoon stretching ahead of you like an open road. You knew even then, or perhaps you know it only now looking back, that these afternoons were something rare. The light, the silence, the weight of a model in your hand. 50 pence. It was never really about 50 pence. It was about the permission to dream within the boundaries of a Saturday afternoon. It was the price of a memory that would last 50 years. A silver coin that bought us a lifetime of particular, irreplaceable feeling. If you remember any of this, share this with someone who was there, someone who knows the smell of that Woolworths floor, someone who shook an Etch-a-Sketch and watched their best work disappear, someone who still remembers the name they gave to that one particular Subbuteo player. Tell them, and then tell us. Leave it in the comments below. Because the real history of those years isn't in the catalogs or the receipts. It is in the specific, irreplaceable memories of the people who were there, holding a 50 pence piece, trying to decide. What did you buy? Thank you for remembering with me.